So for this first presentation, my task is to present the green PFM framework of the IMF. But, sorry, thank you. But before presenting the green PFM framework of the IMF, let me say a few words about the IMF fiscal policy advice in relation to climate change, because as was underlined already several times this morning, fiscal policy and fiscal management, when it comes to climate change, are really the two elements that we need for making progress. And the reason for this is that first, of course, we need good policies to support the government's implementation of their strategies for mitigating the effects of climate change and also doing adaptation to the effects of climate change and meeting the NDCs. But the way to ensure that these fiscal policies are effectively implemented and funded within fiscal constraints without creating any risk to create a debt that is unsustainable over the long term is by using the tools of Green PFM. So let me start first with fiscal policy, and here I'm going to remind you very quickly of a number of facts that I think are well acknowledged in the region, and present briefly the conclusions of a paper that was published by the Asia-Pacific Department of the IMF and the Fiscal Affairs Department of the IMF last year on fighting climate change with fiscal policy in Asia and the Pacific. So the facts first. The facts are that, as you know, the Asia-Pacific region is already highly impacted by climate change, with temperature anomalies that are increasing, and also significant damage from climate-related events during the last decade. Here you have figures that are dating back to 2019, but we know that during the last months, the last years, anomalies and climate-related events have increased, and very recently there was, for example, this typhoon in the Philippines that we all followed. There are also in the region more occurrences of weather-related natural disasters compared to other regions. As you can see on this figure, the share of Asia and Pacific in weather-related disasters is strikingly high compared to other parts of the world. But at the same time, another characteristic of the region is that the region is the biggest emitter of global CO2 in the world, with about half of the global volume being generated in Asia and the Pacific. So this is a complex situation that we are facing in the region. And as you know, this is in particular because of the widespread use of coal. You have here a brief presentation of the fossil CO2 emissions per sector in Asia and the Pacific. And as you can see, the emerging economies in particular are very big contributors. And coal is one of the main sources of electricity production. And finally, to conclude on these facts about the region, air pollution has become a major challenge in Asia and the Pacific. Some of the biggest countries in the region are among the top 10 most polluted cities in the world in 2018. And air pollution is one of the leading causes of mortality in East and South Asia. And this has an impact on economic growth, in particular in developing economies. So the situation that we have in Asia and the Pacific with regards to climate change and pollution is that the country is one of the most impacted, the region is one of the most impacted region in the world, but also has its share of responsibilities in the situation with climate change, and also Asia and the Pacific is a region that is part of this global effort for fighting climate change and this global awareness of the impacts of climate change. But there are also some very concrete impacts in the region, specific to the region, with regards to air pollution and the quality of life for citizens that are very important for decision makers. So now, why is fiscal policy so important in managing these problems? This is because fiscal policy, as we know, since COVID-19 pandemic, is a powerful tool for addressing national and global challenges. And when it comes to climate change mitigation and climate change adaptation, fiscal policy can really have a very important impact. Good fiscal policy can have a very important impact. For climate change mitigation, fiscal policy can increase the efforts to reduce or prevent emissions of greenhouse gas. This can be achieved by well-designed tax policies that raise the price of carbon, together with non-tax instruments in particular. With regards to climate change adaptation, the fiscal policy, the public spending can help minimizing the damage from the climate-related natural disasters. And typically, this will require an increase in government spending, in particular on infrastructure, which needs to be accommodated under the overall fiscal framework. And also, of course, there is the aspect of the transition to a greener, low-carbon economy. And again, this is something that can be achieved with government spending by investing in climate-smart infrastructure, such as renewable power generation, and also supporting research and development in climate-smart technologies. So there are many ways in which governments can help on the climate change front. So I don't have much time, so I'm just going to go very quickly through a number of findings that are further detailed and explained in the IMF paper that I was mentioning, fiscal policies for fighting climate change in Asia and the Pacific. Basically, what the paper demonstrates is that modest carbon taxes could achieve the region's aggregate Paris targets, although more is needed for, addressing some of the challenges that I was just mentioning that go beyond just meeting the nationally determined contributions. The second main finding of this paper is that carbon taxes can also help mobilizing additional fiscal revenue. So this can create fiscal space that may help with funding some of the other fiscal policies that are required for fighting the effects of climate change. Targeted measures focusing on coal usage and power generation can also be effective. So it's not only about carbon taxes. There are other policies that should be envisioned by the governments. And these targeted measures focusing on coal usage and power generation are particularly relevant in the current context of energy crisis that we are going through. This energy crisis was not on the map when this paper was written, but some of the policies that are advised by the IMF are particularly relevant at the moment, given the situation we are facing. Now, getting to mitigation strategies, one thing I want to underline is that countries that are the most exposed to the effects of climate change tend to have also the weakest adaptive capacity, because they don't have the fiscal space for funding all the investments that might be needed. And this is particularly the case for the Pacific Islands. But it's also the case for some of the countries in South Asia, like Bangladesh, or in Southeast Asia, like Myanmar. So we have a problem here, because adaptation can be very costly, and the countries that need the most this adaptation do not have always the resources for funding it. As you can see, the annual cost of upgrading investment and retrofitting existing assets can be very large, and is particularly large for Laos, Indonesia, the Philippines, based on the IMF calculations. And also the annual investments and maintenance cost to protect the economic assets and the government infrastructure on the coasts are very large in some countries. So what can we do when there are such high adaptation costs and countries that have very limited fiscal space? And again, the paper that I'm using for this presentation was written just after the pandemic. So as you know, the situation has not improved since then because of the new crisis we are facing. And you know, when we have high adaptation costs and limited fiscal space, this is where green PFM is getting in the picture. This is about having good fiscal management and good PFM that is allowing to prioritize and plan this necessary spending on adapting and mitigating the effects of climate change within a fiscal envelope that is compatible with sustainable debt over the long term. Another element I want to underline, which is very important, is that, of course, mitigation and adaptation carries very significant cost, but also adaptation investment in particular improves resilience against disasters, and it may limit actually future spending that might be incurred when you have a natural disaster happening, or because of the economic cost of not adapting to climate change. So very often I have discussions with Ministry of Finance saying, look, we can't afford to spend on adaptation or mitigation to climate change because of the complex fiscal situation we are in. But there are also return on investments and also additional costs that might be incurred if these investments are not done. So we need to keep that in mind when we think of the cost-benefits analysis of adaptation investment. So let me conclude now with a few key messages for policymakers. There is a need for greatly increase the efforts to cut emissions, and the IMF paper findings is that carbon tax is most efficient, but there are many other options that might be envisioned, and what matters is results. So the best course of action has to be determined at national level. There is also an important message in this paper, which is that losers from the policies that might be adopted, the carbon tax, for example, need to be identified and compensated, in particular when they are the poorest of a given country. So if you increase the cost of oil, if you put in place some taxes on carbon emissions, you also need to identify which are the parts of the population that need to be compensated for that, because we do not want climate change to have negative adverse impacts on the fight against poverty. The other message is that we need to boost adaptation investment, but again, many of the most vulnerable don't have the fiscal space. which again brings me back to a green PFM that I'm going to briefly talk about now. And, you know, one message that the IMF keeps trying to send in conferences is that when we talk about climate change, and as we are all aware of the fiscal challenges we are facing, what we need to understand is that there will be a need for fiscal reform and for even better PFM in the future, because otherwise the efforts that are required won't be implemented properly and this won't be delivered the way it should. And of course, we are all aware that although fiscal reforms and good PFM is necessary, there is also, in some cases, in particular for the poorest country, a very important question around financing. And you know that there has been long discussions on that at the COP27. We are all aware of this, so I won't get back to this. I just take this opportunity to mention that the IMF has created a fund for helping countries in boosting their resilience, in particular on climate change. So financing is increasing. Now, let me very quickly go through a few slides on green PFM. As I was saying, the first key action that countries need to implement is adopting and identifying the right fiscal policies for fighting the effects of climate change. But then the question is, okay, how can I implement effectively these policies? And this is what green PFM is about. Green PFM is about including in all steps of the budget cycle, in all PFM, the green perspective, the green lenses. This is about considering climate change, NDCs, any other objectives that the government might have in relation to fighting the effects of climate change at all steps of the budget process. So that means that when you have your PFM laws and your PFM system, you may want to include into the legislation a requirement to consider environment and climate change in the way you do your budget preparation and execution. That means that while you're in the strategic planning and fiscal framework stage, which is basically doing your medium-term fiscal framework and medium-term budget framework, you need to include the climate objectives, the climate targets, the climate-related policies into your forecast, tax forecast, revenue forecast, spending forecast. You need to make sure that this spending is integrated in the planning and that this is not going to be bypassed during the annual budget discussion, that the prioritization of spending will take into account these necessary expenditures on mitigation and adaptation to climate change. Then, at the stage of the budget preparation, what does it mean to green this stage? It means that when you present the budget to the legislature, you explain what are the policies that are implemented or proposed in the budget in relation to climate change. You present an assessment of the impact of these policies. You ask, of course, all the line ministries that participate into the budget process to provide the analysis and the information that is necessary for flagging how much of the spending is going to have a positive or negative impact compared to the climate change targets or the NDCs that might have been defined at national level. And during budget execution, you will track how much is spent on climate change related or environmental related policies and whether you are spending as planned in the budget. And finally, even at the control and audit stage, there will be a verification that the spending that has been announced, the targets that have been set and so on, have been met with an external eye. So I don't have much time, so I won't spend too much time on this slide where, of course, there is a lot to say. But I just want to underline also that when we talk about green PFM, actually the Asia-Pacific region is a quite impressive region in terms of the achievements that have already been reached. in Asia and the Pacific, a lot of the elements of a green PFM system are already in place in a number of countries. You have examples here on the slide. I wouldn't say that there is necessarily one country that has all the elements of a green PFM system, but a lot of countries have several of these elements. So, you know, again, Asia and the Pacific is particularly impacted by climate change. It's also a country that has done already a lot of effort on green PFM. And I think one key message for the PEMNA network is that these efforts need to be continued and deepened. But already a lot has been done. I want to spend my few last couple of minutes on one thing, which is how to integrate climate into public investment management, because I was mentioning earlier the crucial importance of investment in infrastructure that is climate resilient, on adaptation of existing infrastructure, on maintenance of existing infrastructure in the face of all the natural disasters that we are facing due to climate change. I just want to underline that maybe you're aware of that already, that the IMF has an assessment framework for public investment management that is called the PEMNA. This is a framework that is allowing to rate and assess the quality of the public investment practices of a country. And recently, there was a climate module that was added to this PEMNA framework to specifically look at how climate change is integrated in all the framework of decision-making and execution of public investment. So this is looking at whether the planning stage is climate aware, if there is coordination across public sector. You will discuss that later in this event. This is about making sure that it's not only the central government that is having climate in mind, but also the SOEs and the local government. This is about making sure that project appraisal and selection is done with climate-related criteria in mind. And then this is about budgeting and portfolio management with a green lens, and risk management, meaning management of the risk in relation to climate and natural disasters. So I don't have the time to detail that, but I want to underline that there have been already several PEMNAs and CPEMNAs implemented, actually 19 already, and several others are starting already. We've done 4 CPEMNAs in the region, in Nepal, in Cambodia, and also we did death reviews for Bangladesh and Indonesia. And these CPEMNAs, in our view, are very useful for making sure that some of the key elements of a green public investment management framework are in place in the countries. I just want to briefly here tell you that we already have some average scores by institution. And what is very clear is that planning and risk management is fairly well done, in particular in the region, but on coordination with other levels of government, on the capacity of central government to make sure that local government and SOEs are doing public investment that is climate aware. On project appraisal and selection and on budgeting, the practices are not good enough. So these are things to have in mind that when there will be the session on assets during the event, the two-day event. Now, the IMF integrates green PFM and green public investment management into a lot of the work that it does at the country level. We are looking at this in the context of the surveillance missions. We also organize regional seminars and training with our colleagues from the World Bank, with the United Nations, and we provide also country-specific technical assistance, including the CPEMNA I was mentioning. If you want to know more about all these tools that I was mentioning, please feel free to click on the links on these slides to the key IMF references, and there will be an important paper published soon on how to implement green PFM. Thank you very much.